So the next person is going to be Joseph Gottlieb. He's going to talk about psychology in these space settlements. Take it away, Joseph.
All right, let me, can you guys hear me?
Mm-hmm.
All right, let me share my screen. Okay. Let's see. 1 second. Bear with me. All right, can everyone see the screen? Okay, so yeah, the brunt of my published work is in analytic philosophy of mind, but I'm actually really happy to be talking about these issues today, because these are the issues that actually keep me up at night. In particular, I want to talk about 3 issues that keep me up at night. And these are sort of the 3 main themes that run through my paper. So 1 is time and our relationship to it. 2, space. And 3, existential risks. Now, in general, what my talk is concerned with is impediments to space colonization. Now, typically, when we talk about impediments to space colonization, we have in mind physical impediments. So a physical impediment might be something like available water resources on exoplanets. So obviously there are water resources, but you might imagine counterfactually, right, that, imagine none of these exoplanets to actually have water resources. That would be a physical impediment to space colonization. We often also talk about technological impediments. So a technological impediment would be our technological know-how and our ability to actually access, for example, water resources. And then finally, and this is less talked about, is psychological impediments. So as I said, the focus is typically on 1 and 2 here, but in my talk, in my paper, my focus is on psychological impediments, understood in a narrow sense to be our our dispositions, habits of mind, and preferences, particularly our preferences about how we apportion things over time. Now, in principle, there are cases where these psychological impediments interact with technological impediments. It's only for forms of technology that would actually drastically speed up space colonization efforts. So it's not going to be any kind of technology that's actually feasible today. So my focus is on these psychological impediments. Now, my thesis is this: our tendency towards steep positive discounting and our tendency towards buckpassing constitutes a particularly strong barrier to collective space colonization that cannot be easily assuaged by standard countermeasures. I have here our tendency towards buckpassing. I have that in brackets because in the video, I didn't get a chance to talk about that due to time constraints, but I might say a little bit about it today. So that's the thesis. So here's some qualifications. First, particularly, so these tendencies are not unique in their application to space colonization, but my claim is that they're especially pernicious here. So we often see them, for instance, in discussion of climate change mitigation. So it's actually pretty well known that the 2 main reports on climate change and what to do about it, the Stern report and Nordhorst report, the only reason they differ in their recommendations is because of their difference in discount rates, right? So this stuff is pretty familiar, but I think it's underexplored in the way it can impact our efforts to colonize space. Collective, that term is also important. So my claims only apply to space colonization by states in which people have shared responsibility for choosing legislation. And this is important because although I'm a pessimist about space colonization, I'm not a complete pessimist. I do think there is some cause for optimism. Finally, my focus is on space colonization as a hedge against existential risk. So in the paper version of this talk, I go over in this in more detail. I kind of wave my hands at it in the video. But I think that although there are a lot of challenges to pursuing space colonization as a hedge against existential risk, I'm an optimist here too. So the biggest obvious issues here are cost-benefit analysis and risk correlation. So risk correlation, I think, is really important and actually an underexplored issue here. So we want to think about the extent to which risks would be correlated across different locations in space, right? So if there's an existential risk that's on Earth, how likely would it be to impact a settlement on Mars, for example, right? So that really matters. But I'm not going to get into these issues here. The point for us is that if we're thinking about space colonization as a hedge against existential risk, this impacts the scope and size of the space colony we're after. And that's really important to my argument, right? And this in turn deepens things like discounting and buckpassing. And it also deepens the moral upshot if you think preserving humanity is of moral importance. So a background assumption here that I will unabashedly defend is that preserving humanity for the long term is one of the most important moral things we can do. And that's why, one of the main reasons why I care about space colonization so much, in addition just because it's awesome. Okay, so the abstract, I think, mentioned some things that are no longer in the talk or in the paper, but the two impediments that I focus on are buckpassing. And so buckpassing stems from the fact that mitigating existential risk is a global intergenerational public good. So again, this is not unique to space colonization, but there are facts about using space colonization as a hedge against existential risk that make this particularly pernicious. Finally, there's discounting. So humans, it's really well known that humans systematically exhibit near bias for both intrapersonal value and intergenerational matters. And what matters here is the intergenerational side. Okay, so we discount future well-being, and what that amounts to is that the same amount of well-being here and now is actually morally worth more than the same amount of well-being in the future. And even with enough time, even very small discount rates, right, can have massive impacts in this regard. And I just want to emphasize, before I wrap up, that the rationality, so whether it's rational to discount the way we do, completely irrelevant to the point I'm making. The fact is we do. So this is a descriptive thesis, not a normative thesis, right? What matters is that we do exhibit these discount rates. There are exceptions, some people don't. That also matters too for my overall picture that I want to push, but the fact remains is that by and large, most people discount pretty steeply, in fact. So why are these things important? Why are they especially pernicious to space colonization? Well, briefly, right, I make 3 points. So they're not defeated by standard countermeasures, things like co-benefits or piggybacking. So that's one reason. Second, the sheer timescales involved exacerbate the problem. So, right, and this actually makes it worse in things like climate change. We're actually, climate change is typically pitched as an intergenerational justice issue. That's true, but we're actually being impacted by climate change now. So it actually obscures an important difference when you think of it solely in that way. So sheer timescales that would be involved in the kind of colony you would need to have a meaningful hedge against existential risk, that's another difference. And then finally, history is not encouraging this regard. So most examples of multi-general projects that we've undertaken in humanity's history are either not counterexamples in the relevant sense to our tendency towards discounting, or they just provide cold comfort from an existential risk standpoint. Okay. So those are, in general, the main points I make in the presentation. And now I'll stop here and let you guys pepper me with questions. Let me just stop the screen share here. Okay.
Okay, Jason, did you want to ask a question here? Is your hand just up from last time? All right. I guess your hand's just up from last time. Caleb.
So thanks for your talk. You mentioned that not everyone is susceptible to these biases to the same extent. So I'm wondering then, my suspicion is that the people who are going to be doing the space colonization, who would do it, are probably not going to have these sorts of biases. So I wonder then, what really is the problem if like the average person has like a strong discounting bias?
Okay.
If the people that are actually involved are not going to have it.
Great. So thanks for the question. This is a good question. And I'll try and answer it as succinctly as possible, but I have like 1,001 things to say about this. So yeah, as I said before, I am not a pessimist across the board about space colonization. So I'm interested in, so one of the big background themes here, I'm interested in liberal democracies and the way in which they can handle handle facing our future. So this is somewhat of an idealization, but the idea is that the decisions that in a liberal democracy, right, the way decisions are made is they're in part a function of just ordinary people. So I'm concerned with the ways in which discounting rates hobble collective action on space colonization. So yes, there's always people, and I call these people visionaries, there's always people that are exceptions that are able to think over the long term in ways that the average person isn't. And you're right, those are the people that perhaps may be leading space colonization. Now, why does that matter? Well, here's one reason why it might matter. You might think that we're losing something important by not having collective efforts towards space colonization. So if you think, so here's an example. Suppose you just, to take an obvious case, right? So Elon Musk, right? So Elon Musk is someone who is beating the drum about colonizing Mars. And in fact, he puts this, his motivation is for existential risk mitigation. So the phrase he often uses is backing up the hard drive. Now, when these efforts are led by corporate entities that are not necessarily in the interests of everyone, right? We might lose something of moral importance. Now, again, this is operating on idealization because it might turn out that in a liberal democracy or something like that, right, it might not work any better. But what matters is whether you think there's a moral difference between it being led on a collective basis or being led by corporations that have their eyes on the long term, like SpaceX or something like that, right? So it's going to depend on how that shakes out. But in principle, there is a moral difference. So it could be, like, do people have say, right? Does the everyday person have a say in how these colonies end up looking, right? And that might not be the case when you're just relying on what I call visionaries, these outlying people who just, push for the future.
Okay, Eric Hughes.
When I said I was good with death earlier before we got started, it was on this talk specifically. And I just wanted to put out there rather bluntly that I do not share the normative exhortation that mitigating existential risk is worth doing. Humans are mortal, the sun is mortal, the entire human race will die out at some point or else transition into something else. And to my eye, this is actually one of the possible resolutions of the Fermi paradox, is that emotionally mature aliens, to the extent that phrase means anything, they just understand their own mortality and they're fine with it. That the effort to do otherwise is too great to do anything else. So I'm not opposed to space colonization, but in the paper you use the phrase, I wrote it down, we should sell space colonization. And I can tell you that, like, selling it on the basis of fear of death is getting straight into advertising manipulation territory in my book. I don't think it's a value that humanity needs.
Yeah, so thanks, Eric. So a few things here. So for one thing, I don't think we should sell. So selling, right? So there's two questions. There's one, why we should pursue space colonization. And then there's two, how we should sell it. And how we should sell it need not be in terms of why we actually ought to do it. So in fact, I don't think we should sell it in terms of existential risk mitigation. That's not how we should sell it. But that actually runs into the problem because the other means of selling it don't actually in any way help us, right? So the commercial interests and things like that, because one, they don't automatically lead to space colonization efforts. And two, the size that you need for these commercial efforts, like, I mentioned helium-3 mining or asteroid mining, right? The difference between that and a colony that would actually provide a meaningful hedge against existential risk is so big that the discounting rates are still going to be operative and it's not going to make any difference. But let me get to your other point. So about whether humanity is worth preserving. So again, I'm not prepared to provide a full-fledged defense of that thesis. It is an assumption of the paper, and I grant you that it's controversial along two lines. One, whether this is something that we're morally obligated to do, which you apparently reject, and then two, assuming it is something we're morally obligated to do, why, right? Why is it? Why are we morally? So both of those issues are contested and complicated. But when I say, just to be clear, when I say that humanity is worth preserving, that's just shorthand for another claim, right? Which I think is what's worth preserving is consciousness. And actually certain particular forms of consciousness. So a background commitment I have is that one of the things that grounds value in the universe is the presence of consciousness. So actually what I'm interested in is the preservation of consciousness. in particular certain forms of consciousness that I think ground moral value. So it's actually not about humans per se. So even if we, if you're a transhumanist or we transition to something else, right, I'm fine with that, actually. So I'm eliding over certain my background commitments here just to simplify things, but that's not quite what I'm committed to.
Okay, Sarah?
Yeah, this might be, I don't know, I feel like I've got a lot of thoughts floating through my head, but I guess what I was wondering is how this idea relates to historical colonization, right? I mean, because historically, we've also had a situation where, you've had large scale mass migrations of people into regions where initially there was not great access, but, access improved over time. And as the access improved, you found various people, deciding to make that decision. And it, it was collective migration, right? And a lot of times with collective interests, but it seems like with, but often with very individual motivations, right? Like individual families deciding that a situation was untenable, or they didn't have the resources where they were, or they, they were facing some sort of oppression or something like that. So I'm just curious, like how those kinds of historical movements of people connect with this kind of analysis of colonization and what would motivate it, and whether that suggests that the long-term discounting gets kind of overcome by something about those personal motivations.
Yeah, so I don't think in those cases the actual discounting is overcome, because you actually have to look at the motivations for the people doing it. So like when people make, for instance, like transatlantic, trips, like, they're moving from, I don't know, continental Europe to, to America or something like that. I mean, again, it depends. So to be honest, I haven't actually looked too much into this, so I appreciate the suggestion. I think I should look into it more. But at first pass, right, what I would think is that oftentimes these people are motivated by short-term game, or at least relatively short-term game. So like, not short-term in the sense that it's going to happen today, but like, they think, okay, there's going to be better opportunities for me in this new land, and that's why I'm going. And the better opportunities are going to be realized at a relatively short-term basis. So what we're dealing though with existential risk mitigation is something completely different, at least on its face, right? Because, right, these things seem very, very distant. It is a bit like what's going on with climate change, but as I noted before, right, it's actually worse, I think, than what's going on in climate change. So yeah, I'd have to look at this more, but I want to dig into exactly what the motivations are for these people. So one of the other examples I give in the paper is St. Peter's Basilica. So I think there's a reasonable interpretation, because that was an intergenerational project. People were building this, it took like 120 years to do this. But I think like, if you actually look at Catholic theology in that case, what their motivation was the worship of God, and that was a present, immediate concern, right, that they were facing right then and there. And I wonder what maybe something like that is going on in the for example, the transatlantic migration sort of stuff. But it's a good suggestion. I think I'll have to look into that more.
Yeah, I think that if I can follow up just briefly, I think that part of my question about the existential risk thing is I'm also wondering whether existential risk will necessarily be led up to by things that look like immediate threat, right? I mean, is it really that existential risk is always 100 years out in the future, or are you going to expect that there's a series of, increasing global pressures and global catastrophes leading up to that would change that calculus? But that's
well, it's actually an empirical question. So I'll just answer briefly. So just to give you an example. So a lot of people think unaligned artificial intelligence could be an existential risk. I do. That's controversial, but that's a view I'm inclined towards. And some people think that can happen overnight because of things like intelligence explosions and stuff like that, the way these things actually work. So yeah, it's another question that's worth looking into, but I think it's an open empirical one.